Killed elsewhere, and her body was placed into that trunk not long before she was discovered there in March of 1979.
While investigating a case, the police spoke to all the students at Polton Village apartment complex when they came across one guy who described how he had an ungodly smell coming from his cupboard. He also had this horrible liquid oozing from the ceiling. He thought an animal had got trapped up there and had died, but when the police went to investigate, they recognised the smell straight away. They soon were able to get a search warrant for the flat above, and when they went in the cupboard, they found a trunk. After going through the trunk and moving all the newspapers, they came across a hand. Hi, my name's Sara Jade and welcome to my channel, where we talk about true crime, solved cases and more. Now let's get on with this week's case. Helen Holly Maddox was born on the 26th of May 1947 and was the oldest of 5 children and came from a very conservative family. Her parents, Fred and Liz Maddox, were God-fearing and her father was a veteran. And although he was very strict, he was very intelligent. However, Holly was more free-spirited and didn't always fit in with the East Texas way of life. She lived a normal small-town life and was described as lovely, bright and very popular. She was also a cheerleader, and her brother described how she was very intelligent but also very graceful and was lovely to everyone. Being a free spirit, she wanted to move away. So at the age of 18 in 1965, she moved to Philadelphia and studied at Bryn Mawr College. Around the time Holly was coming of age, the youth were fighting against the establishment, questioning authority and rebelling, and Holly started to meet people with the same ideals as her. The counterculture movement around free love and sexual revolution was starting to build. And this is where, in 1972, Holly met Ira Einhorn. Ira Einhorn was born on the 15th of May 1940 and was born into a middle-class Jewish family. He studied English at the University of Pennsylvania and started to get involved in the ecological groups and the countercultural movement. He also became involved in the anti-establishment and anti-war campaigns in the 1960s and 70s. He was also a speaker at the first Earth Day in 1970 and claimed he was instrumental in setting it up, although this was later refuted by the event organisers. He was described as very smart and was a guest lecturer at Harvard University. He tried to run for mayor as a third-party candidate for Philadelphia, and he was a prominent anti-war activist and was seen as up-and-coming in the world of politics. His name Einhorn is German for unicorn, so he described himself as the unicorn. That day, Holly was enjoying a coffee and reading her book when Ira came over and made a comment about her book. He said, "You must have a beautiful mind, and I didn't even realise how beautiful you are." They soon became friends, and Holly became enamoured by his ideas and his activism. They became inseparable and soon started dating, and eventually they moved in with each other. Holly's father, being the conservative man that he was, wasn't happy with this and stopped talking to Holly. However, she still had a relationship with her mum, and they used to write letters to each other all the time. After college, Holly stayed in Philadelphia to live with Ira, but everything wasn't smooth sailing. They would argue all the time and break up and get back together. Holly left him a couple of times, but he'd always work his way back into her life. By the summer of 1977, they had been together for 5 years, and Holly had eventually had enough, and she left him for good. Holly had decided to rent another apartment and to move on with her life. Her friend Joyce Pasek had also invited her to spend some time with her at her house in Fire Island. Joyce was very wealthy and very eccentric, and had a house down on Fire Island, which is just down from Long Beach in New York. While she was there, she was introduced to a man called Solar-Podis, who was also on the island at the time, and would spend all their time getting to know each other on his boat, when one day Holly disappeared. On Liz's birthday, she never received a call from her daughter, and she thought this was very strange as Holly always spoke to her on her birthday. She called up her brothers and sisters to see if they had spoke to her, but when no one had heard from her, they all started to get worried. Her mum decided to call Ira and find out what was going on. Ira explained to them that Holly had left him ages ago and she was now living with her boyfriend up in New York. Her mum became worried and contacted the police in September 1977 in Philadelphia and reported her missing. The problem was Holly was a young girl who would go travelling quite a lot, and they believed that she was just out on another one of her trips and she would contact them when she got home. A few months later, and there's still no sign of Holly, her parents become frustrated and get in touch with an ex-FBI agent called Bob Stevens. He agrees to work with his partner, J.R. Pierce, on the case. Pierce goes straight to her old apartment and speaks to Ira, but he tells him the same story. She had left him and was now living with her boyfriend up in New York. He also explained that she might be in a commune in India, as she'd been in one in California and always wanted to travel to India. They also go and speak to a couple of her friends in the area, and they speak to one of her friends, Janine Berman, who said she was quite upset as Holly wanted to rent an apartment from her. She had come to collect the keys, but she hadn't heard from her ever since. The police thought this was a bit strange, so they asked her about Holly's new boyfriend, and she was able to give them all his details. Solopedus had an apartment in Manhattan and was the complete opposite of Ira. He was tall, intelligent and nicely dressed, and there was an instant attraction between the two of them. They hit it off straight away and spent 2 or 3 weeks of the summer getting to know each other. Pierce goes up to Manhattan to speak to Sol to find out what was going on. He was very cooperative and said they had a whirlwind relationship, but he hadn't heard from her since the summer. He described how he'd last seen her on his boat. They'd gone out for the evening on his boat when he received a call. When he answered the phone, it was Ira. He couldn't understand how he got his number, but he passed the phone over to Holly. Holly had a heated conversation with Ira, and when she got off the phone, she told Sol that Ira was so upset that she was here with him. He had told her if she didn't come back now, he was going to throw out all her stuff. Sol tried to persuade her to stay, but she said she wanted to go and get all her stuff and she could handle Ira. So she left that day and he hadn't heard from her since. He just thought her and Ira had got back together, so he went home to Manhattan. Although Sol was still a suspect, they decided to go and speak to Ira again. While they were there, they decided to speak to the other students in the apartment complex, when they came across one guy who told them about an ungodly smell coming from his cupboard. He lived in the flat just below Ira, and when they went to check it out, they recognised the smell. The student also told them that he could remember them arguing all the time, and one night he'd heard a loud bang on the ceiling. After gathering all this information, Pierce passed all the details to Detective Chipworth and told him he had enough information to go and get a search warrant for Ira's house. They first decided to polygraph Sol to make sure he was telling the truth, and soon he passed and was let go. Then finally, 19 months after Holly's disappearance, they were able to get a search warrant for Ira's house. They planned to rip up all the ceilings and all the floors to find as much information as they could, but they knew where they had to go first. They went straight to the cupboard, which was directly below the man's downstairs. They realised there was a lock on the door, but after picking the lock, they were able to get in. When they opened the door, there was boxes full to the ceiling. They had to go through each and every box to find out if there was any information. When looking through each of the boxes, they came across her handbag, her pocketbook, and her driving licence. After going through most of the boxes, they came across a large steamer trunk. When they opened the box, they came across loads of newspapers dated September 1977, which was the day that Holly went missing. After moving away some of the newspapers, they came across a hand. They stopped straight away to preserve the evidence and took the box straight to the medical examiner's office. Ira was taken into custody and charged with her murder. When searching the house, they came across Holly and Ira's diaries. Within those diaries, painted a disturbing picture of Ira's mentality. He described beating women and how the joy flowed through him. Holly's diary also confirmed that she suffered from domestic abuse. The medical examiner's report came back, and it reported how she was beaten to death with a blunt object and her skull was crushed. Ira was represented by the prominent area inspector who was a former DA. Ira was also connected to a lot of prominent people in the political world and knew a lot of wealthy people, and he brought them all to his bail hearing, and they were able to give statements to testify how great he was. Although the defence claimed that he was a serious flight risk, the testimonies paid off, and he was given bail of $40,000, which he only had to pay $4,000, and he was let free. Ira then used his time to persuade the media that he was innocent. He said that it was been set up by the FBI and the government, as he was very close to finding out about their mind control weaponry. His cult believed him and supported him. January 1981, and Ira was set to stand trial for Holly's murder. The problem was Ira had already fled and didn't turn up to court. An international manhunt started, and they searched for him everywhere. The police had little luck and had no clue where he was, until one day a guy walked into the police station. He told them he believed Ira was in his house. He'd been on holiday in the US and was telling his friends how he'd met this nice man and he was renting a room in his house. When they asked him what his name was, he said Ira Einhorn. They then told him he was a convicted murderer and was on the run, and told him to go straight to the police station. So they finally knew where he was, but there was a problem. The US didn't have a treaty with Ireland at the time, which meant they couldn't arrest him or do anything. Ira soon found out and fled, and went missing for another few years. 7 years go by, and Holly's dad committed suicide after suffering from a terrible illness. Her mum then passed away 1 year later. They were never quite the same after Holly's murder, and they were never able to see the justice their daughter deserved. Then in 1990 the law changed, which meant they could try Ira in absentee. This meant they could go ahead with the court hearing, and everything would be the same, except Ira's seat would be empty. He was soon found guilty and charged with life in prison. This meant that if he was ever caught, he would go straight to prison for life. They still investigated the case, and soon they were able to find out his friend Barbara Bromford had been helping him for years. She came down to Canada to speak to them and told them everything that had happened. She said she'd believed him at first and was helping him out, but after hearing a story about him, she had changed her mind. She then told them he was currently living with a lady called Anita Flodin. They decided to change tactics and thought if they looked for Anita, they might be able to find Ira. While searching into her case, they found out that she had tried to change her driving licence in Sweden to a place in France. Ira had now been on the run for over 16 years, and they were finally able to get the French police to surveillance him and to get the proof that he was there. Once they were able to locate him, they raided his house early one morning and arrested him in his bed.
I've never ever been able to relate to Ira as the accused murderer. It's something that is there, I know it, but it's in the outside world.
We've been together almost constantly for 14 years, 25 years.
As the US had a treaty with France, they thought it was going to be easy to bring him back and send him to prison. However, the French authorities thought it was against his human rights to extradite him and send him straight to prison without a retrial. So they let him go, and he was protected by the French authorities.
Is there anything you would say to the Paddock family?
Holly's family were not going to give up that easily, and they spent the next few months trying to petition to get a law passed so that Ira could get a retrial on his return. And soon the Ira Einhorn law was passed. They then travelled to France and held up pictures of Holly to show them that she was a real person. The media started to listen to them, and soon the French authorities agreed to extradite him. It took another 3 years, but eventually in July 2001, he was extradited back to the US. When being taken to the airport, he decided to commit one last protest and decided to slash his throat.
I have something to say very directly to Mr. Jospin. Il criait ça. I want him to regard this, and I want him to begin speaking to his people, to remember that he's a socialist, to remember that he was a Trotskyite, to remember that he was part of my generation who cared about people, and we still care.
However, it didn't work. They just patched him up and sent him on his way.
À bientôt. Le médecin est là, non?
Le médecin est derrière.
Oui, le médecin.
Juste derrière. Celui qui a les lunettes là-bas.
I'm innocent. I want a fair trial. I will be happy to go to the United States if a court gives me a new trial.
Ira Einhorn will get a new trial if he requests it. I will be there. And he can no longer use that as an excuse to avoid the consequences of beating my sister to death.
He was given a new trial, and eventually, in October 2002, he was convicted of murder and sent to prison with life without the possibility of parole.
For all the people who helped Ira Einhorn in his escape, I hope this verdict weighs heavy on their conscience.
And eventually died on the 3rd of April 2020 from natural causes.
Dead this morning at a prison outside of Pittsburgh. Einhorn was serving a life sentence for killing his girlfriend Holly Maddox in Philadelphia in 1977.
Her family want people to know that domestic violence can happen anywhere, and if you see it, you should report it. As if one person had said something about Holly, she might be here today. Thank you for watching, and if you like this one, be sure to check out this one, where a warehouse worker loses the plot and tries to kill his colleagues. Thank you for watching, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.
You call me a saint, but you know I'm a stranger.